The day I told my husband I was pregnant, I thought he'd hug me. I remember exactly how I planned it. I had bought a small pair of white baby socks and wrapped them in tissue paper, and I set them on the kitchen table where he always dropped his keys. I stood there with my hands pressed together, waiting for him to walk in from another one of his meetings that never seemed to lead anywhere. When he saw the box, he opened it slowly. He looked at the socks for a long moment. Then he looked at me. I thought he'd hug me. Instead, he set the box down very carefully, like it might break, and he walked past me into the bedroom. I heard the closet door slide open. I heard hangers scraping against the metal bar. I stood in the kitchen not understanding what was happening until he came back out with a suitcase in his hand. He looked me in the eyes. Jason had always had kind eyes, the kind that made strangers trust him within 5 minutes of meeting him. That day they weren't kind. They were empty, like he had already left long before his feet ever crossed the doorway. "I'm not ready to be a father," he said. That was all. No apology. No explanation. He didn't say he needed time, or that he was scared, or that we could talk about it. He said one sentence, like it was a business decision, like he was declining an investment that didn't fit his portfolio. Then he walked out, and I heard his car start in the driveway, and I heard it pull away, and the sound of the engine faded until there was nothing left but the hum of the refrigerator and the box of baby socks sitting open on the table. I did not cry that night. I think I was too stunned to cry. I sat at that kitchen table until it got dark, and I didn't turn on the lights, and I just kept touching the little white socks like they could tell me what I had done wrong. I found out I was completely on my own within the week. Jason had been the one managing our finances, chasing his big idea that was always 6 months away from taking off. The joint account had almost nothing in it. My name wasn't on the lease of the house we'd been renting, because he said it was. Simpler that way. I had my job, a modest teacher's salary, and a belly that was growing every single day, and that was the whole of what I had. I was 7 months pregnant when I packed my own suitcase smaller than his, because I didn't have much to put in it, and moved into a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. The heater rattled all night. The window in the bedroom didn't close all the way, so I taped a folded towel along the frame to keep out the draft. I remember lying on the mattress on the floor, because I hadn't been able to afford a bed frame yet, feeling my son kick against my ribs, and whispering to him that I was sorry the room wasn't nicer, that I would make it nicer, that I promised. I worked until 17 days before I gave birth. I stood at the front of my classroom with my hand pressed against the small of my back, teaching 7-year-olds their multiplication tables, smiling through the ache in my spine, because if I sat down I was afraid I wouldn't be able to get back up. And I couldn't afford to miss a single day of pay. When my son was born, I named him Ethan. I chose the name myself, alone in a hospital room, because there was no one else there to help me choose it. A nurse held my hand during part of the labor because I had no one to call. I remember looking down at his small red face for the first time and feeling something crack open inside my chest, not sadness, not exactly. Something more like resolve. I decided right there, with him still warm against my skin, that whatever else happened, he would never once feel like he was a burden. He would never know what it was to be looked at the way his father had looked at that box of baby socks. The years that followed were not kind, but I don't regret a single hour of them. I went back to teaching as soon as I could, and in the evenings I cleaned offices in a building downtown, vacuuming under desks that belonged to people who made more in a month than I made in a year. My neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, an older woman who lived 2 doors down, would watch Ethan for a few dollars an hour while I worked. She fed him dinner most nights. She was there for his first steps, not me, and there is a particular kind of grief in that, in missing your own child's beginnings because you are somewhere else scrubbing a stranger's floor so that child can eat. I was tired in a way that lived in my bones. Some nights I would come home so late that Ethan was already asleep on Mrs. Alvarez's couch, and I would carry him back to our apartment in my arms, his head heavy on my shoulder, and I would think, this is not the life I imagine. This is not what I pictured when I was a young bride standing in a church believing every word Jason said to me. But I never let Ethan see the exhaustion turn into bitterness. When he was old enough to ask about his father, and he did ask, more than once, in that plain and searching way that children ask difficult questions, I never told him that Jason was a coward. I never told him his father had looked at a pair of baby socks and chosen to run. I only ever said the same thing, in different words, every time. One day you'll decide for yourself what kind of man he is. I said it when he was 5 and asked why he didn't have a dad at his school's Father's Day breakfast. The year I sat in that seat instead, wearing a tie I'd bought just for the occasion. I said it when he was 6 and a classmate asked him where his father lived and he came home confused, not understanding why he didn't have an answer. I said it, and I meant it, because I still believe that a child deserves the truth eventually, on his own terms, in his own time, and not filtered through his mother's anger, however justified that anger might be. It wasn't easy to hold my tongue. There were nights I lay awake composing furious, brilliant speeches I would never deliver, arguments I would never get the chance to make. But every morning I woke up and packed Ethan's lunch and walked him to school, and I let the anger settle back down into whatever place I kept it, because raising a good, whole person mattered more to me than being right. 7 years passed like that. Slowly, and then all at once, the way years do when you're just trying to survive them. I had started to feel, if not happy, then at least steady. We had moved to a slightly bigger apartment. I had been promoted to lead teacher at my school. Ethan was in 2nd grade, obsessed with dinosaurs, missing his 2 front teeth, sleeping with a stuffed triceratops he refused to wash because he said washing it would wash away the smell of home. Life had found its rhythm. I had stopped waiting for anything to change. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, while I was helping Ethan with his spelling words at the kitchen table, there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I remember wiping my hands on my jeans and telling Ethan to keep practicing his words as I walked to answer it, half thinking it might be Mrs. Alvarez asking to borrow sugar again. It was Jason. I almost didn't recognize him. The man who left me 7 years ago had been handsome in a careless, confident way, always dressed sharp, always talking about the next deal that was going to change everything. The man standing on my doorstep looked like a photograph of that man left out in the rain too long. His hair had gone gray at the temples. His clothes hung looser on his frame than they should have. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, and a heaviness in the way he stood, like every part of him was tired. "Please," he said, before I could speak, before I could even fully process that it was him. "Can I meet my son?" I don't know how long I stood there. Time seemed to fold in on itself. I thought of every version of this moment I had imagined over the years, slamming the door, screaming at him, calmly telling him he had lost that right the day he packed his suitcase. I had rehearsed 100 different reactions in my head across 7 years of nights, and in the actual moment, standing there with the porch light buzzing above us, I found I had none of them ready. I just stood there, the words gone from me completely, staring at the stranger who used to be my husband. Behind me, I heard Ethan's small voice. "Mom? Who is it?" I turned around. My son stood in the hallway in his dinosaur socks, his spelling notebook still in his hand, looking between me and the man on the doorstep with the open curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to be afraid of strangers. I told Jason to wait. I closed the door most of the way, not all the way, and I crouched down to Ethan's height, and I asked him if he wanted to know who was at the door. He nodded. I told him it was his father. I will never forget the look on his face. Not shock exactly. Something quieter than shock. Something like recognition of a shape he had always known was missing. I let Jason in that night, but only for 20 minutes, and only with me sitting 3 feet away the entire time, watching every word that passed between them like a hawk. Jason didn't try to explain himself to Ethan. He didn't make excuses. He mostly just asked Ethan questions about school, about the dinosaurs, about the stuffed triceratops that Ethan, shy at first, eventually held up to show him. When Jason left that night, he asked quietly if he could come back. I told him I would think about it. I didn't sleep at all. For days afterward, I turned it over and over in my mind, the way you turn over a stone looking for what's underneath. I was certain I knew the real reason he had come back. His business, the one that had always been 6 months from success, must have finally collapsed, the way I had always privately suspected it would. He must be broke. He must have nowhere else to go. No one else to lean on, and after 7 years of silence he had remembered he had a son who could, eventually, be some kind of safety net, some kind of family to fall back into. I was so sure of this story that I had already built my response to it. I was ready to tell him, calmly and clearly, that he could not use our son as a financial plan. I was wrong about all of it. Jason came back a second time, on his own, without asking to see Ethan first. He asked if we could talk, just the two of us, and something in his voice made me agree. We sat on my small balcony, the one that overlooked the parking lot instead of anything scenic, and he was quiet for a long time before he spoke. He told me that a few months earlier, he had started having headaches that wouldn't go away. He told me about the scans, about the words doctors had used that he still had trouble saying out loud. He told me the prognosis, plainly, without asking for pity, in the flat voice of a man who has already cried through every version of grief he has access to and has nothing left but the facts. He wasn't there because his business had failed. He wasn't there for money. And he made a point of telling me he wanted nothing from me, no forgiveness demanded, no financial claim, nothing. He said he hadn't come to fix 7 years in a handful of visits. I don't want him to remember me, Jason said, and it took me a moment to understand what he meant, because it sounded backward at first. He explained, he didn't want Ethan's only memory of him to be built entirely out of absence. He didn't want his son to grow up defined by a father-shaped hole and nothing else. He said, I just want one chance to tell him that leaving wasn't because I didn't love him. His voice cracked on the next part. It was because I was too weak and too afraid. He told me that the day I showed him those baby socks, something in him had simply short-circuited. He wasn't proud of it. He said he had spent 7 years running from the shame of it, building a life that felt, to him, like proof he'd made the right choice, and none of it had ever actually made the shame go away. He said the diagnosis had done something strange to him. It had stripped away every excuse he'd been telling himself, because there was no more time left to keep telling them. I sat there on that balcony and I felt so many things at once that I couldn't separate them into individual feelings. Anger, old and familiar, the kind that had kept me warm on cold nights when nothing else could. Grief, for a version of our family that had never gotten the chance to exist. And something else, something I didn't expect and didn't want, a kind of aching sympathy, not for the man who had left me, but for the boy inside him who had apparently never learned how to stay. I did not forgive him that night. I want to be honest about that. Forgiveness isn't a door that swings open all at once. For me, it opened slowly, 1 inch at a time, over many more conversations. But I thought about Ethan. I thought about the questions he would carry with him for the rest of his life if I closed this door now. Not questions about why his father left, because I could always answer those eventually in my own words. But questions about why I hadn't let him decide for himself. I had told my son, over and over, for 7 years, that one day he would decide for himself what kind of man his father was. I realized, sitting on that balcony, that I couldn't keep that promise and slam the door at the same time. A decision requires information. A choice requires the chance to actually meet the man in question. So I said yes. I let them see each other. Slowly, carefully, always with boundaries I set and reset as I learned more about what felt safe. Jason took Ethan to the park near our building on a Saturday afternoon, the two of them walking a little stiffly beside each other at first, like people learning a new language out loud in public. I watched from a bench close enough to see them but far enough to let them have their own conversation. I saw Jason crouch down at one point to look at something. Ethan had found a rock, maybe, or a bug, and I saw my son laugh at something his father said. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind I hadn't expected to see directed at that particular man. When they came back, Ethan ran ahead of Jason toward our apartment, his face flushed from the cold and from something else, something lighter. He burst through the door still wearing his coat. "Mom," he said, breathless. "Can I see him again?" I stood in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel still in my hand, and I felt my eyes fill up before I had decided whether I wanted to cry or not. I smiled at my son through the tears, because there was nothing else honest I could do in that moment. I understood something standing there that I don't think I would have understood any other way. Forgiving someone doesn't mean pretending the wound never happened. It doesn't mean forgetting the 7 years I spent building a life out of almost nothing while he built a different life somewhere else. Forgiving him didn't erase a single one of the nights I carried my sleeping son up 2 flights of stairs alone. But sometimes forgiveness isn't really about the person who hurt you at all. Sometimes it's about giving your child a chance at something you never had the luxury of choosing for yourself, the chance to know both halves of where he came from, the chance to ask his own questions and hear his own answers, the chance to decide, on his own terms and in his own time, exactly what kind of man his father turned out to be. I still don't know how much time Jason has left. I don't know how many more Saturdays at that park there will be, how many more rocks and bugs and laughs I'll watch from a bench a careful distance away. Some days that not knowing feels unbearable. But I know that whatever time remains, my son will not spend it wondering about a stranger. He will spend it knowing his father's voice, his father's face, the particular way his father tilts his head when he's really listening. And when the day eventually comes that he has to say goodbye, he will be saying goodbye to someone real, not to an absence, not to a suitcase disappearing down a driveway 7 years too long ago. Children don't choose the parents they are born to. But parents choose, every single day, whether to be there. I think about that a lot now, about the years I spent being the one who chose to stay, who chose to show up exhausted at parent-teacher conferences and dinosaur-themed birthday parties and every ordinary Tuesday in between, and about the years Jason spent choosing not to. And I think about how, in the end, he made one more choice, at the very end of his own story, to try to be there in whatever way was still left to him. Would you have opened the door after 7 years?